Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast for today. After our introduction to Islam, what we're looking at today is the political implications, the Islamic empires as they are known. We're going to look at them in four stages. They're called regimes, that is to say, the people who are in charge. And the first regime is based around the life of Muhammad, who is the founder of the faith. But as we'll see, it's a little more complicated than just that. First of all, remember that he is a Bedouin Arab. He is a Semite who believes in polytheism. He is an orphan and he's adopted, but his people believe in many, many gods, including the Kaaba, which, if you remember, is that structure that at the time had all sorts of different gods that people from many different religions worship. In terms of his society, he's a part of a clan, which is like an extended family, and then a bunch of extended families make up a tribe in their society. And this is an aspect about Islamic culture based on the Arab society that will continue well after the rise of Islam. As I mentioned, he was an orphan. His parents were both killed. He was adopted by a great uncle, and he was raised to become a merchant. And he was making money off of all the pilgrims coming to the Kaaba who were worshiping all of these different gods. He ends up marrying a woman named Khadija, who's his first wife, and in Arab society, it's not uncommon to have many wives, but the first wife is the most important, if you will. But when he's married, he has this moment where he is given a revelation. He literally goes to a cave to sort of be alone, and God speaks to him and says, "There's only one God." And as you'll remember from the last lesson, the purpose of his teachings is that humans are supposed to submit to the will of the one true God. That then is the revelation, and that becomes the basis of the Quran, which Muslims believe is directly from God through Muhammad. He starts to teach this idea that there's only one God, but it's not so well received. Like the Arabs that he is a member of, they believe in many gods and they're quite comfortable with that. And he's forced to flee from Mecca to Medina, and this is called the Hijra. This is year zero. If you remember at the very beginning of the year, we talked about different ways of structuring time. In Islamic society, this marks their zero. So their calendar is a little bit off from the one that we use in the Christian West. But there he starts to get a little bit more of a following. People start accepting his teachings a little more. And in fact, he starts to get an army. Like he's not just getting believers, he's getting people that are willing to fight with him. He returns back to Mecca and literally conquers it. Once he's there, he destroys all of the false idols in the Kaaba, and it's a scene very much similar. If you remember the scene in the New Testament where Jesus goes to destroy the money changers in the temple, it's a holy place, and he finds this really, really disturbing. But what's very, very different about Muhammad compared to, say, Jesus or Siddhartha, is that he's actually leading an army. It's not just a new kind of faith. It's a state, and he is the military leader. When he dies, though, there's a question about who should take over for him, because he is, again, not just the leader of a faith, a new faith. He's the leader of a state. He's conquered people, and he's built this small kingdom. And so who's going to take over in all of those roles? And that becomes a contentious issue, but it leads to our second period, the Rashidun, the four rightly guided caliphs. And that term caliph is really important. But again, the question is who should lead? Now, this will lead to the first big split within Islam. It's much more complicated than this, but this is sort of the fundamental of it. There are those who think that the Ummah, that is the body of believers, the community of the faithful, should elect somebody who is the most pious, like the best Muslim. These people are known as Sunni. But there are others called Shia who think it should be a member of Muhammad's family, that it should be like a bloodline, like a dynasty would be in your typical empire. Again, it's much more complicated than that, but this is the beginnings of this split that is going to become more and more pronounced over time. The Eventually, the first successor, the first caliph, is Abu Bakr, who is he's the father-in-law. He's the father of one of Muhammad's wives, and he was one of the earliest converts. He was one of the first people to follow Muhammad's idea that there is only one God. And so most people accepted the fact that he should be the leader. He was related by marriage, but he was also the most pious. He is the caliph, and that's an important term because this is a part of a new kind of state, a caliphate. The caliph is not only the military and political leader. We've seen that before. Like, that's not uncommon for the leader of an empire, but he's also the religious leader. If you can imagine, it's kind of like you're not only the emperor, but you're also the pope in the Catholic tradition, which we'll get into much more detail next week. But this is a new kind of state because it's mixing the military and political part that we normally associate with an empire with the leadership of an actual faith movement. He conquers the rest of Arabia, the part that Muhammad wasn't able to conquer himself, and then starts expanding outward into Persia. The Sassanid dynasty, the last Persian dynasty, is still in power there, and also into Egypt in northeast Africa. He dies, and then Umar becomes the second caliph. What happens to him? Does he just die of natural causes, or some people say he's assassinated? It's not really clear. He is replaced by Uthman, who, again, there's mysterious, circumstances, but it seems more clear that he was in fact assassinated. And then Ali becomes the fourth caliph. Now, you don't need to know the names of the individual caliphs, but everybody in the community agrees these four are the guys that should be in charge. But here's where it gets tricky. Ali was Muhammad's cousin and also his son-in-law. He married one of Muhammad's daughters, and the Shia believe he should have been the caliph in the first place. They believe that he was the one selected by Muhammad. But he is assassinated, and then it turns into chaos because now nobody really is clear about who should be in charge until eventually a guy named Muawiyah, who again, you don't need to know these individual names, but the point is he is from a different clan. All of these former caliphs were from the same clan as Muhammad. So this is a totally different bloodline. This then establishes the third regime, the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, here's the thing about the Umayyads. They are ruling in the name of a religion. It's a caliphate. It's not just a military and a political leadership, it's also a religious leadership. But they are Arabs. And as they are expanding outward, that's going to become an issue. If you notice that the time of their period is relatively short, and the capital city is in Damascus, which is in Syria, much more, it's very close to the Mediterranean area. They're going to continue as a caliphate, though. So, like, even though they're not from the same family as Muhammad, they claim that religious authority over the church, as well as the military and the political authority. They will expand the empire even further. They're going to conquer all of Persia and even get over the Indus River into South Asia. And to the west, they're going to conquer all of North Africa and even Spain in the southwestern part of Europe. All of this is part of their giant empire. One of the issues, though, is why do people convert to Islam as they are expanding? There's this tendency that we'll look at much more closely in class to think that they just forced everybody to convert, but it's not that simple. They had this idea of dhimmis, which literally means the people of the book. They thought that Christians and Jews, because they all worshiped the God of Abraham, were related to them, and so they did not have to convert as long as they paid a special tax called the jizya. The jizya is, like, you don't have to convert, but you got to pay this tax if you continue to practice the religion of Abraham that's not ours. And curiously, a lot of people will choose to convert just because they don't want to pay the tax. It's an unusual thing, but we're going to see this happen over and over and over throughout many different regions. People don't like taxes at all. Never have, never will. So much so that some people will choose to convert. But socially, they've got a problem. They are all Arabs, the ruling family, and the elite are all Arabs, but the teachings of Muhammad state that anybody who is a Muslim is equal. And that's a problem as they are expanding and conquering all these different ethnicities and these different races. And there's this attempt in the Umayyad Caliphate to try to impose the superiority of the Arabs over non-Arabs, which goes against the teachings of the faith. And as a consequence, it kind of leads to a tension that we'll see gets resolved by the overthrow of the Umayyads. In this particular map, what you see is the dark area that is conquered by Muhammad in his lifetime. Then you can see it expanding outward. That is what's conquered by the rightly guided caliphs, the Rashidun. And then on the furthest outreach is what is conquered by the Umayyads. Then notice that that includes Spain. That turns out to be a big deal because that social tension where Arabs think they're superior to every other Muslim, even though that's not what Muhammad taught, it turns into such a problem that eventually a new dynasty will overthrow them. These are the Abbasids. They're more of an Islamic empire insofar as they accept more different ethnicities and races as long as you are a Muslim. Their reign, however, is kind of questionable, as we'll see, because they stay in power over the faith, but they kind of lose some political power over time. They claim that they are descendants of Muhammad's uncle. They they are Sunni by and large, but the fact that they also claim to have a bloodline satisfies the Shia, and so they seem, relatively popular. They move the capital, though, from Damascus to Baghdad, which it's closer to Persia. And one of the cultural elements here is we see that it starts to become a little more Persian and blending with the Arab society. But it's not just Persians, there's many other ethnic groups, racial groups that are now included and much more accepted under the Abbasids than was the case in the Umayyads. In the Abbasid era, though, the Islamic culture sort of reaches its height, a golden age of Islamic empires that's sort of symbolized by the House of Wisdom. It's kind of the first university, if you want to think of it that way. It was a place where scholars from all these different traditions, even those that did not include Islamic teachings, were invited to study and debate and write and translate. And it was a great melting pot of intellectual activity: math, science, medicine, literature. We'll look more closely at that later in the week, but it all sort of like flourishes in this brief period of time under the Abbasids. One of the more interesting things, though, is they preserved these texts from Greece and Rome that, as we'll see next week, have largely been discarded. So they actually preserve the traditions of rationalism that we associate again with Greece and Rome when Europe was not really that interested in them. We'll come back to that later on. At the same time, though, during this time period, there's a different sect of Islam called Sufism that develops. And we'll talk much more about this in class, but whereas the Sunni Shia split is interested in who should be in charge, the Sufis are more interested in what is your personal experience with God. It's a very personal type of relationship. Again, we'll talk much more about this in class at the beginning of the week. In the time of the Abbasids, you'll notice the territory is not so big as the Umayyads, but they do last a whole lot longer. But one thing I want you to notice, the Umayyads are still in control of Spain. And in fact, they call themselves a caliphate there. They think they are still the legitimate rulers of the church. The Abbasids obviously don't believe that at all, but the Umayyads do, and they still have that territory, but it's in Europe, interestingly enough, not in what we know in this time period as the Middle East. Nonetheless, the Abbasids will decline and fall, just like every great empire. In their case, though, it's social issues, but very different from those that occurred for the Umayyads. For the Abbasids, the social problems arise because of their openness to other ethnicities. They have all of these different groups that sort of merge together, but they're all separated in different functions. For example, the Arabs tend to be more associated with the religious function, but the Persians tend to be more associated with the administration function. And then the Turks are more associated with the military function. Many of them were initially slaves. They came from Central Asia. There were great warriors on horseback. They were enslaved and forced to become soldiers, but then many of them converted to Islam, and then they are not supposed to be slaves because they're Muslims, so they become like the soldiers. But out of that mix, the power starts, the grip on power starts to lessen. And so we get these new forms of government called emirs, which is an Arabic word, although it's also a Persian word, and sultans. And these are different than caliphs. The Buyids are a dynasty that capture Baghdad, the capital city of the Abbasids. They are Persians, and they call themselves emirs. And an emir is a military term, but they also assume political authority, but they leave the caliph in place. So the Abbasid caliphate is still technically there. It's just that now their dynasty is only responsible for the religion, while the Buyids are taking over the military and political responsibility. They will eventually be overthrown later on by another group that does the same thing. But what you can see here is once they do that, the whole empire starts to break up into these different groups who claim political and military authority, even as they leave the religious authority in the power of the caliph back in Baghdad. So technically, the Abbasids are still, the caliph, but they don't have the military and political power. After the Buyids, though, the Seljuk Turks capture Baghdad, and they claim the title Sultan. And this is one we're going to see an awful lot of, because a sultanate is essentially the same as an emirate. It's just the Turkish word. But again, it's the idea that you are the military and political authority, but the caliph is still in charge of the religious function. But everybody's going to copy them, largely because the Seljuks will sort of conquer all of the emirates and form a kind of military and political empire. But again, the caliph is still responsible for the faith. So they're doing their thing as a sultanate, but the caliph is still technically in charge of the religion. In 1258, though, the Mongols show up, and Hulagu Khan, who's one of the many grandsons of Genghis Khan, will capture Baghdad, and the caliph is ended, but so too are the Seljuk Turks. But as we'll see, they sort of move to the west and transform themselves. But this in turn leads to another form of government. Again, the diversification of states and empires is a key concept for this time period. As we'll see, they invent this kind of government called a khanate. We'll get more into that later on, though, when we get to the chapter on the Mongols. So, again, the basic idea here, the political implications are the development of this new kind of government that mixes military, political, and religious authority in a way that we have not seen before. But then it splits again into sultanates, where you've got Muslim military and political empires with somebody else in charge of the religion. And as we'll see, that is the idea that sort of spreads beyond the heartland of the Islamic world. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you were able to annotate the notes. Don't forget about the focus questions, and we'll see you in class.